When an avoidant person withdraws from you, when they create distance or end the relationship, when they claim you're too much or too needy or too demanding, the natural response is to question yourself. You examine your behavior searching for mistakes. You wonder if you pushed too hard, asked for too much, moved too fast. You internalize their withdrawal as evidence that something is wrong with you, that you failed somehow, that if only you had been different, calmer, more patient, less emotional, the relationship would have worked. This self-blame is exactly what the avoidant person's defenses are designed to create. By framing your normal relationship needs as excessive demands, by treating your reasonable expectations as pressure, by responding to your emotional honesty as if it's overwhelming intensity, they shift responsibility for the relationship's failure from their incapacity to your inadequacy. But this narrative is backwards. The avoidant person's withdrawal, their discomfort with your behavior, their inability to meet your needs, these aren't evidence that you're doing something wrong. They're proof that you're doing something profoundly right. You're offering genuine intimacy, consistent presence, emotional honesty, and clear communication. You're showing up as a secure, available partner who wants real connection. The avoidant person's negative response to these healthy behaviors reveals their dysfunction, not yours. Their discomfort with your consistency proves your consistency is threatening their defenses. Their withdrawal from your vulnerability proves your vulnerability is real, rather than the curated, controlled sharing they're comfortable with. Their complaints that you want too much prove you're asking for actual partnership, rather than accepting the breadcrumbs they're used to providing. Understanding that the avoidant person's rejection is actually validation of your health rather than evidence of your failure is the perspective shift that allows you to stop questioning yourself and start recognizing that you're too evolved for someone still trapped in their wounds. Your effort threatens their entire defense system. The avoidant person's entire psychological structure is built on the premise that relationships are dangerous and self-sufficiency is essential for survival. They learned early that expressing needs led to rejection, that showing emotions created burden, that depending on others resulted in disappointment or harm. These early experiences shaped defensive strategies centered on emotional independence and relational distance. The avoidant person survived their attachment wounds by deciding they don't need anyone, that they're fine alone, that they can meet their own needs without risking vulnerability or dependence. This defensive structure has protected them from pain, but also isolated them from genuine connection. When you enter the avoidant person's life, demonstrating consistent effort, showing up reliably, expressing care through actions and words, following through on commitments, being emotionally present and available, you're attacking the foundation of their defensive system without realizing it. Your effort proves that people can be dependable, that relationships don't have to be sources of disappointment, that someone can show up consistently rather than sporadically. This proof is terrifying to the avoidant person because it challenges the core belief that justifies their entire way of relating to others. The avoidant person cannot accept your effort without their defensive structure beginning to crumble. If they acknowledge that you're reliable and consistent, they must confront that their belief in people being fundamentally unreliable is a defensive distortion rather than accurate assessment of reality. If they receive your care and presence, they must acknowledge that they do need and want connection, despite spending years convincing themselves they don't. If they allow themselves to depend on your consistency, they risk the pain they've spent their life protecting themselves from experiencing again. Your effort forces choice between maintaining their defenses and allowing genuine connection, and the defenses almost always win because they feel essential to survival. The avoidant person responds to your effort in ways designed to restore their defensive equilibrium. They minimize your efforts by claiming they don't need what you're offering. They create distance to reduce their exposure to your consistency. They pick fights or manufacture problems to justify withdrawing. They frame your effort as pressure or neediness rather than acknowledging it as care and commitment. All of these responses serve one purpose: protecting their defensive belief that relationships are dangerous and self-sufficiency is safer. Your effort threatens this belief, so they attack or dismiss your effort rather than examining their belief. When the avoidant person tells you that you're trying too hard or putting in too much effort, they're actually telling you that your effort is working. It's penetrating their defenses. It's making them feel things they don't want to feel. It's challenging their comfortable narrative about relationships and themselves. If your effort were meaningless or irrelevant, they wouldn't need to comment on it or push back against it. The fact that they feel compelled to diminish your effort reveals that it's having an impact they cannot ignore. Your effort also threatens the avoidant person's defensive strategy of keeping partners at arm's length through minimal investment. The avoidant person is accustomed to relationships where effort is imbalanced, where they give little and receive pursuit in return. This imbalance keeps them safe because it confirms that others want them more than they want others, maintaining their position of control and power. But when you show up with genuine, consistent effort, you're not creating imbalance where you pursue and they withdraw. You're demonstrating what mutual effort could look like, and this demonstration is deeply uncomfortable because it implies they should reciprocate your investment. The avoidant person has convinced themselves that their minimal effort is sufficient because previous partners accepted it or even increased their own effort to compensate for what the avoidant person wasn't providing. But your consistent effort, without desperate pursuing energy, reveals that healthy relationships involve both people showing up with similar levels of investment. The contrast between your effort and their minimal investment becomes undeniable. They cannot maintain the fiction that they're investing adequately when your effort shows them what actual investment looks like. This exposure of the effort gap creates shame in the avoidant person that they cannot process or acknowledge. Instead of recognizing that they should increase their effort to match yours, they defend against the shame by attacking your effort as excessive. They claim you're doing too much, that relationships shouldn't require this level of investment, that your effort is proof of your neediness, rather than recognition of their withdrawal. This reframing protects them from confronting their own deficiency by making your adequacy the problem. Your effort also threatens the avoidant person's narrative about previous relationship failures. They've typically blamed those failures on their partners being too needy or relationships being inherently problematic. But your presence as someone who is secure, makes appropriate effort, and isn't desperate or clingy challenges this narrative. If you're putting in healthy effort and they still cannot reciprocate, then maybe previous relationship failures weren't about their partners being too much. Maybe the failures were about the avoidant person being too little, too defended, too unavailable. This possibility is intolerable to their ego and their defensive structure. Rather than examining this possibility, the avoidant person doubles down on their original narrative. They find ways to frame your healthy effort as unhealthy. They interpret your consistency as clinginess. They experience your emotional presence as overwhelming intensity. They treat your clear communication as pressure. These distorted interpretations allow them to maintain their belief that partners are the problem while avoiding recognition that their own defensive unavailability prevents the intimacy they claim to want. The ultimate threat your effort poses is that it might actually work. If the avoidant person allowed themselves to receive your consistent care and presence, if they let themselves depend on your reliability, if they opened to genuine connection with you, they would experience the intimacy they've been avoiding. This intimacy would feel good in moments, providing the connection all humans need. But it would also activate all their attachment, wounds and fears. They would become vulnerable to being hurt again, the way they were hurt before. They would risk the disappointment and abandonment they've organized their entire life around preventing. Your effort threatens to give them what part of them desperately wants, while activating the terror another part feels about having it. This internal conflict is unbearable, and the way the avoidant person resolves it is by rejecting your effort entirely, by withdrawing from you, by ending the relationship, by claiming you're not compatible. They escape the threatening intimacy your effort was creating. This withdrawal isn't evidence that your effort was wrong or too much. It's evidence that your effort was right and threatening to their defenses, that it was working to create real intimacy, that you were being exactly the kind of partner healthy relationship requires, and they weren't ready for that. Your consistency exposes their patterns. The avoidant person's patterns remain invisible when their partners are inconsistent, anxious, or pursuing. In those dynamics, the chaos created by the partner's anxiety obscures the avoidant person's contribution to the relationship's dysfunction. The avoidant person can point to their partner's pursuit, emotional reactivity, or inconsistent behavior as the problem, while their own withdrawal appears to be reasonable response rather than primary issue. But when you show up with genuine consistency, when you're emotionally regulated, when you maintain steady presence without pursuing desperately, you create mirror that reflects the avoidant person's patterns back to them with uncomfortable clarity. Your consistency means the avoidant person cannot blame relationship problems on your inconsistency. When you text regularly, follow through on plans, show up emotionally when you say you will, maintain your word reliably, there's no inconsistency for them to point to as source of dysfunction. The relationship problems that arise cannot be attributed to you being flaky or unreliable, because you're demonstrably neither of those things. This removes one of the avoidant person's primary deflection strategies and forces them closer to recognizing that they are the source of the relationship's difficulties. The contrast between your consistency and their inconsistency becomes stark and undeniable. When you show up for every plan while they cancel frequently, the pattern is obvious. When you respond to messages within reasonable timeframes while they disappear for days, the disparity is clear. When you remain emotionally present during difficult conversations while they shut down or withdraw, the difference in capacity is evident. Your consistency provides baseline against which their inconsistency is measured and found lacking. This exposure of their patterns is deeply uncomfortable for the avoidant person because it threatens their self-image. They've typically convinced themselves that they're reasonable, that their behavior is justified, that their needs for space and independence are legitimate, and any problems in relationships stem from their partner's excessive needs. But your consistency proves that someone can maintain healthy boundaries while still being present, can value independence while still being reliable, can need space while still being available. You demonstrate that the qualities they claim to value don't actually require the extreme withdrawal and inconsistency they exhibit. Your consistency also reveals that the avoidant person's withdrawal is not responsive, but rather automatic. In relationships with anxious partners, the avoidant person can claim their withdrawal is reasonable reaction to their partner's pursuit or neediness. But when you're not pursuing anxiously, when you're maintaining your own groundedness and consistency, their withdrawal cannot be explained as response to your behavior. They withdraw when you're calm. They create distance when you're giving them space. They become unavailable when you're not demanding anything. This pattern reveals that their withdrawal is about them and their patterns, not about you and your behavior. The avoidant person typically responds to this exposure by attempting to provoke inconsistency in you. They might start behaviors designed to trigger your anxiety and pursuit. They might withdraw dramatically, hoping you'll chase them, which would then justify their withdrawal as response to your pursuit. They might create problems or drama that would give them something to point to as explanation for their distance. All of these attempts are efforts to restore dynamic, where your behavior can be blamed for their withdrawal rather than their patterns being recognized as the source. If you maintain your consistency despite these provocations, if you refuse to become anxious or pursuing in response to their withdrawal, the avoidant person faces crisis. They cannot make the relationship problems about you because you're not contributing to those problems. They cannot claim you're too much because you're demonstrably not overwhelming or demanding. They cannot blame your behavior because your behavior is consistently healthy and appropriate. They're forced to either examine their own patterns or end the relationship to escape the uncomfortable exposure your consistency creates. Most avoidant people choose to end the relationship rather than examine their patterns. This choice isn't evidence that you weren't right for them or that your consistency was somehow inadequate. It's proof that your consistency was exposing their dysfunction so effectively that they had no defense except escape. They're running from the mirror you held up, not from any problem with you. The relationship had to end because your presence made it impossible for them to maintain their comfortable delusions about themselves and their patterns. Your consistency also exposes how little the avoidant person has been offering. In relationships where both people are inconsistent or where one person is anxiously pursuing, the avoidant person's minimal investment doesn't stand out as clearly. But when you're showing up consistently with healthy effort and presence, the gap between what you provide and what they provide becomes obvious. You're demonstrating what partnership looks like while they're offering breadcrumbs. This contrast makes it impossible for them to maintain the fiction that they're doing their part in the relationship. The avoidant person experiences shame about this gap, even if they cannot acknowledge it consciously. The shame drives defensive responses designed to minimize your consistency rather than increase their effort. They might claim your consistency is actually neediness disguised as health. They might suggest you're trying too hard or being inauthentic. They might frame your reliability as control or your presence as pressure. These defensive reframings protect them from the shame of recognizing how little they've been contributing compared to what you're offering. Your consistency also exposes the emptiness of the avoidant person's claims about what they want in relationships. They typically say they want connection, partnership, intimacy, but their behavior contradicts these stated desires. When you show up offering exactly what they claim to want, their withdrawal reveals that they don't actually want what they say they want. They want the idea of connection without the actual vulnerability it requires. They want partnership in theory, but not the sustained presence it demands. They want intimacy as concept, but not the emotional exposure it necessitates. Your consistency calls this bluff by providing what they claim to seek and revealing that they run from it when it's actually offered. Your boundaries force them to confront themselves. The avoidant person is accustomed to relationships where boundaries are either absent or poorly maintained. Anxious partners often have weak boundaries, accepting behavior they shouldn't accept while hoping the avoidant person will eventually change. Secure people who haven't recognized the avoidant patterns early often gradually erode their boundaries through repeated exposure to the avoidant person's inconsistency and withdrawal. These weak or absent boundaries allow the avoidant person to continue their patterns without consequences, treating the relationship and their partner in ways that would be unacceptable in healthy relationship. When you enter with strong, clear boundaries that you actually maintain, you create entirely different dynamic that the avoidant person cannot navigate using their usual strategies. Your boundaries communicate that certain behaviors are unacceptable to you and that you will not remain in relationship where those boundaries are violated. This is radically different from what the avoidant person is used to encountering. Most of their previous partners stated boundaries, but then allowed those boundaries to be crossed repeatedly while remaining in the relationship. This pattern taught the avoidant person that boundaries are suggestions rather than actual limits. But your boundaries are real limits. When you say you need consistent communication and the avoidant person disappears for days, you don't just express disappointment and wait for them to do better next time. You address the violation directly and make clear it cannot continue. When you state you need follow through on plans and they cancel repeatedly, you don't keep making new plans hoping they'll eventually show up. You stop making plans until they demonstrate reliability. When you express that you need emotional presence during conflicts and they stonewall or withdraw, you don't chase them or accept their shutdown. You end the conversation and make clear that stonewalling is not acceptable in relationship with you. These maintained boundaries force the avoidant person to choose between honoring your boundaries by changing their behavior or losing access to you. This choice is threatening because it removes the option they're most comfortable with, continuing their patterns while maintaining the relationship. They're used to partners who complain about their behavior, but ultimately accept it. Your boundaries say that acceptance is not forthcoming, that actual change in their behavior is required for the relationship to continue. The avoidant person typically responds to strong boundaries with anger or dismissiveness. They might claim your boundaries are unreasonable or too rigid. They might suggest you're being controlling or demanding. They might frame your boundaries as evidence that you're not compatible, rather than acknowledging that your boundaries are healthy standards they're unwilling or unable to meet. These responses are defensive reactions designed to make your boundaries the problem, rather than their behavior being recognized as inadequate. Your boundaries threaten the avoidant person's comfortable position of doing minimal work while maintaining relationship. They've operated under assumption that they can offer breadcrumbs, and partners will accept those breadcrumbs as sufficient. Your boundaries communicate that breadcrumbs are not sufficient for you, that you require actual presence and effort, that the minimal investment they're accustomed to providing will not work with you. This threatens to require genuine change from them, which activates all their defenses because change means vulnerability and risk. Your boundaries also force the avoidant person to confront that their patterns have consequences. In relationships where boundaries are weak, the avoidant person can withdraw, be inconsistent, remain emotionally unavailable, and face no real consequences for these behaviors. Their partner might express hurt or disappointment, but the relationship continues, and the avoidant person eventually returns to their usual patterns without making any fundamental changes. But your boundaries create actual consequences. Violation of your boundaries leads to end of relationship, not just to expressions of sadness that you eventually move past while accepting continued poor treatment. This reality of consequences is sobering for the avoidant person because it means they cannot maintain their patterns indefinitely while keeping you as option. They must actually change or they will lose you. This ultimatum, though you may never state it directly, is implicit in your maintained boundaries. The avoidant person senses this ultimatum and experiences it as pressure, which triggers their defenses and often leads to their withdrawal. They'd rather leave than change because leaving allows them to maintain their patterns and self-image while blaming the relationship's end on incompatibility rather than their unwillingness to meet healthy standards. Your boundaries reveal what the avoidant person is and isn't willing to do. If they had genuine capacity and desire for healthy relationship, they would recognize your boundaries as reasonable and work to honor them. They would see your boundaries as roadmap for how to treat you well, and they would follow that map. The fact that they experience your boundaries as unreasonable pressure rather than helpful clarity reveals that they're not capable of or interested in the kind of relationship you need. This revelation is valuable even though it's painful. It proves that the relationship cannot work, not because of any deficiency in you, but because of their limitations. Your boundaries also challenge the avoidant person's narrative about previous relationship failures. They've likely blamed those failures on partners who were too needy or had unreasonable expectations. But your boundaries are clearly reasonable standards for healthy relationship. You're not asking for too much. You're asking for basic respect, consistency, emotional presence, and follow through. The fact that the avoidant person cannot or will not meet these basic standards reveals that previous partners probably weren't too needy either. They were likely asking for similar reasonable things that the avoidant person experienced as excessive, because anything beyond minimal investment feels excessive to someone deeply defended against intimacy. When the avoidant person ultimately withdraws because they cannot or will not honor your boundaries, their departure proves that your boundaries were necessary and appropriate. Someone who was capable of healthy relationship would have welcomed your boundaries as clarity about how to treat you well. The avoidant person's departure in response to your boundaries demonstrates that they were not that person. You were right to have boundaries, you were right to maintain them, and you were right to make clear that violations would have consequences. The avoidant person's exit is them choosing their patterns over partnership, their defenses over vulnerability with you, with their comfort over growth. This choice proves they weren't ready for what you were offering. Your departure proves they weren't ready for what you offered. The most definitive proof that you are doing things right comes when you choose to leave the relationship with the avoidant person. This departure, when done from a place of clarity and self-respect rather than anger or hurt, demonstrates that you recognize your worth and refuse to accept less than you deserve. The very factors that make the avoidant person uncomfortable with you, your consistency, your effort, your emotional honesty, your boundaries. These are the exact qualities that make you too healthy for someone still trapped in their wounds. Your decision to leave is often the clearest signal that you were never the problem. People who are genuinely doing things wrong in relationships, who are actually too needy or demanding or unstable, typically don't leave relationships with avoidant people. They stay, hoping to finally get the love and validation they're seeking, accepting less and less, while the avoidant person gives less and less. They become more anxious, more pursuing, more willing to compromise their standards and needs. The fact that you reached a point where you recognized the relationship wasn't meeting your needs and you chose to leave indicates that you maintained enough self-worth and clarity to recognize dysfunction and exit it. The avoidant person often responds to your departure with surprise or confusion. They expected you to stay and keep trying, to accept their minimal investment indefinitely while hoping they'd eventually change. Your departure challenges this expectation and forces them to confront that their behavior had consequences they didn't anticipate. Some avoidant people pursue briefly when you leave, triggered by loss of control and fear of abandonment that underlies their avoidant patterns. This pursuit is not evidence that you should have stayed longer. It's confirmation that you leaving was the only thing that penetrated their defenses enough to trigger genuine response. But even when they pursue, if you maintain your departure, you prove that you value yourself more than you value potential relationship with someone unwilling to meet your needs. This self-valuation is exactly what healthy attachment looks like. Secure people recognize when relationships aren't working, and they exit those relationships rather than staying and eroding themselves to fit someone else's limitations. Your ability to leave demonstrates security that the avoidant person lacks. They cannot leave their defenses. You could leave the relationship when you recognized it wasn't healthy. This difference in capacity proves who had the greater health and maturity. Your departure also validates every effort you made during the relationship. You tried. You showed up. You communicated clearly. You maintained boundaries. You offered genuine partnership. The relationship failed, not because you didn't do enough, but because the avoidant person couldn't receive what you offered. Your departure acknowledges this reality. You're not leaving because you failed. You're leaving because you succeeded at being a healthy partner, and that health was incompatible with the avoidant person's dysfunction. The pain you feel after leaving, if you feel pain, is not evidence that leaving was wrong. It's evidence that you were genuinely invested, that you cared, that you wanted the relationship to work. This capacity to care deeply and invest genuinely is strength, not weakness. The avoidant person's likely absence of similar pain is not evidence of their strength, but of their continued defense against feeling. They avoid pain by avoiding genuine attachment. You feel pain because you allowed genuine attachment to form. Your pain proves you were doing relationships in a healthy way, while their absence of pain proves they were not. Your departure creates space for you to find partnership with someone capable of receiving what you offer. Every day you spent with the avoidant person was a day you weren't available for someone secure and emotionally healthy. Your departure ends this opportunity cost and returns you to availability for appropriate partnership. This shift is a tremendous gift you give yourself, even though it might not feel like gift immediately. You're choosing your future happiness over your current comfort or hope that the avoidant person will change. The avoidant person's response to your departure, whether they pursue briefly, then withdraw, whether they immediately move on, whether they express relief, none of these responses are about you or your worth. They're about where the avoidant person is in their own journey. Their response to your departure says everything about them and nothing about you. Someone ready for healthy relationship would have done the work to keep you. Someone not ready either doesn't recognize what they're losing, or recognizes it but isn't capable of doing what would be required to maintain it. Either way, their response proves they weren't ready for what you offered. Years from now, if the avoidant person does the work to heal their attachment wounds, they will likely look back on the relationship with you as one of their biggest regrets. They will recognize that you offered them genuine partnership and they couldn't receive it because of their defenses. They will understand that you were the right person at the wrong time in their development. They will wish they had been capable of appreciating and meeting what you offered. This future regret won't change the present reality, but it confirms what you need to know now. You were never the problem. You were doing everything right. The avoidant person just wasn't ready for right. Your departure is final gift to the avoidant person, even though they probably cannot recognize it as such. By leaving, you're showing them that their patterns have real consequences, that people with self-respect will not accept their minimal investment indefinitely, that they cannot maintain relationships while continuing to avoid genuine intimacy. This lesson is one the avoidant person needs to learn if they're ever going to heal their patterns. Most people enable the avoidant person's dysfunction by staying too long, accepting too little, compromising too much. Your departure refuses to enable. It says clearly that their patterns are not acceptable and that you will not sacrifice your well-being to accommodate their wounds. Some avoidant people never learn this lesson because everyone they encounter either pursues them anxiously, which confirms their defenses, or leaves with anger and blame, which allows them to make the other person the villain. But if you leave with clarity and calm, if you simply acknowledge that the relationship wasn't meeting your needs, and you chose to leave because you deserve partnership with someone capable of showing up, you offer the avoidant person the clearest mirror they're likely to encounter. You're not attacking them. You're not claiming they're bad or broken. You're simply stating that who they currently are is not compatible with who you are and what you need. This mirror, if they ever develop capacity to look at it honestly, shows them exactly where their work lies. The ultimate proof that you were doing things right is that you reached the point of leaving. You recognized dysfunction. You assessed clearly that the avoidant person was not going to change sufficiently to meet your needs. You valued yourself enough to choose the discomfort of leaving over the ongoing pain of staying. You trusted that better partnership exists for you with someone capable of receiving your efforts, consistency, honesty, and boundaries. All of these recognitions and choices demonstrate emotional health and maturity that the avoidant person lacks. Your ability to leave proves you were always too healthy for someone who couldn't leave their defenses, too secure for someone still imprisoned by their wounds, too evolved for someone refusing to grow. Their loss, not yours.